Welcome to your first official music theory lesson. Today, we're going to talk about the basic building blocks of all harmony, intervals. An interval is simply the distance between two notes. There are names for every possible interval, but today we're going to focus on the two smallest intervals, whole steps and half steps. The distance from A to B is called a whole step. Notice something very important about this. We skipped a note. B flat is between A and B. That's because a half step is the distance between A and B flat. It is also the distance between B flat and B. A half step is the smallest possible interval between two different notes. To play a half step, you simply take the note you're on and you play the next note right next to it. It's got to be directly next to it. So if I'm on A and I ask you to play a half step above it, I'm talking about this B flat. If I ask you to play a half step directly below it, I'm talking about this A flat right here. A whole step is comprised of two half steps. That's why going from A to B, skipping the B flat, is a whole step. A whole step below A, in the opposite direction, skips this A flat and lands on this G right here. Okay, let's get a sense of what these intervals sound like. We'll look at whole steps first. A whole step up from A is B. In this video and in future videos about intervals, I'm going to give some examples of where you might have heard these intervals before. When you're training your ear, it can be very useful to have some anchor points or some melodic references to associate with each interval. Now, with each interval, there are three ways to play it: ascending, descending, or together. For example, an ascending whole step sounds like this. You might recognize it as the first two notes in Happy Birthday. Happy birthday to you, happy birth. Or you might recognize it as the first two notes of Rudolf the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Rudolph, Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer, Rudolph. A descending whole step is the first two notes in Three Blind Mice. Starting on B. Three blind mice, three blind mice, three blind, three blind. That's a whole step, descending. A descending whole step is also the first two notes of Mary Had a Little Lamb. Mary, Mary had a little lamb, Mary. When I play the notes together, the sound is sweet, but it feels a little bit unstable. Remember, I can play a major second starting on any note. It doesn't have to be this A-B situation. It could be D and E. Happy birth, three blind mice. Or it could be F sharp and G sharp. Happy birth, three blind mice, three blind. Any of these will still have the same sweet, unstable quality when I play them together. One thing I want to mention is that a whole step isn't necessarily two white notes together or two black notes together. For example, a whole step up from E is an F sharp. It skips this note F. And a whole step up from B flat is this note C. It skips this B here. A whole step is just you play a note, you skip the next one, and then you play the one after that. The color of the key doesn't matter. It's worth mentioning here that when I play these intervals, typically I'm staying in the middle of the piano-ish. If I go too low, it starts to sound pretty muddy and unclear. And if I go too high, you can still hear it, but it's a little bit piercing. Typically, when you play notes all together, this mid-range of the piano here is where you're going to get the most pleasant clarity. Okay, on to half steps. Ascending, this interval sounds like the Jaws theme. It's also the first two notes of the Beatles song, A Hard Day's Night. It's been a hard, it's been. Descending, it's the first two notes of For Elise, that famous classical piece. Ready? It's also the first two notes of Joy to the World. Joy, joy to the world. When I play them together, it sounds extremely dissonant and jarring. Like the notes don't really agree with each other. Half steps are the smallest possible interval, and every other interval can be defined as some number of half steps. For example, like we said earlier, a whole step is 2 half steps. Very important to realize something here, by the way. I've seen a lot of people count like this. Let's count a whole step up from E. We know that a whole step up from E is this F sharp, but sometimes I've seen people count it like this. 1, 2, 3 half steps. How did we count 3 half steps? We know a whole step is only 2 half steps. We got the number 3 incorrectly by counting the starting note. That was where we went wrong. The starting note doesn't count because we're counting not notes, but distances. We're counting how many half steps from this note brings us to the new one we're looking for. So from here, 1 half step, 2 half steps. That's how we get the right answer of a whole step is 2 half steps. Cool. Whole steps and half steps are special intervals because they're so small and so common. And naturally, they have a couple different names. A whole step can be called a whole tone or also a major second. These are all exactly the same thing. They're totally interchangeable. Half step can also be called a semitone and also a minor second. Totally interchangeable. So, half steps and whole steps are the smallest intervals in music. We'll take a brief interlude and go to the opposite end of the spectrum, talk about a bigger interval called an octave, spelled like this. An octave. An octave is the distance between any note and the next note of the same letter name. So for example, from this A to this next A, that is an octave. Or from this F sharp to this F sharp, also the distance of an octave. Just like with whole steps and half steps, I can go up an octave up from this A is this A, or I can go down an octave down from this A is this A down here. All right, let's get a sense of what octaves sound like. See if you can play a C octave with your left hand. Most people can stretch their hands out this distance. Some people can actually stretch their hands further than an octave. On a good day, I can get from a C to this E here. I've heard that Rachmaninoff, the famous classical composer, actually was able to get his pinky here and his thumb stretched all the way to this A, which is insane. Anyway, some people with really small hands might not be able to get from this C to this C. They might only be able to get from this C to maybe this B here, but the majority of people can get at least an octave. The octave position is super useful. Since the two notes are technically the same, C and C, when you play them together, they sound nice and clean. E and E, A flat, B and B. For an octave, I always think about the song Somewhere Over the Rainbow from The Wizard of Oz. Somewhere over the rainbow, somewhere. That's what an octave sounds like, ascending. An ascending octave is also the first two notes of the song, I'm Singing in the Rain. I'm singing in the rain, I'm singing. Descending, I think of the Etta James song, Willow Weep For Me. Actually, I don't know if it's a Etta James song, but I know that she sang it. Willow, weep for me, willow, willow. There's another beautiful jazz standard called My Funny Valentine that has a great example of a descending octave in the last line of the chorus. Stay each day, stay each day is Valentine's Day, stay each. YouTube links to videos of all these songs being performed are in the course materials, and the links will take you right to the point in the songs so that you can hear the interval. So I definitely recommend checking those out so you don't have to listen to me sing these little snippets. Now, here's my question for you. How many steps are there in an octave? Excuse me, how many half steps are there in an octave? Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can count it. Did you pause the video? If you haven't paused, go ahead and do it. You'll get more out of the experience if you try counting it yourself. Okay, the answer is that an octave is 12 half steps. If you got 13, go back and try again, and remember not to count the first note. We have from C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 gets us C. 12 half steps. Great. That about covers it for whole steps, half steps, and octaves. Let's get you started working with this stuff.